The president is less than 3 weeks away from when he said he would name a new Supreme Court justice to replace Justice Stephen Breyer, who will retire at the end of this term. He's making headway on that, tweeting today, "There's a long list of extraordinarily qualified black women to serve on the Supreme Court. After 232 years and 115 justices, we're finally going to put one on the bench," unquote. Joining me now with more on all of this is Nicole Killion and Christina Ruffini. Nicole is a CBS News congressional correspondent, and Christina, CBS News correspondent covering foreign affairs. So, Nicole, let's start with the latest on the Supreme Court. President Biden will meet tomorrow with Senate Democrats on the Judiciary Committee. What do we know about that meeting in particular, and overall where this process stands?
Well, I think that's what members hope to get an update on, is where things stand from the viewpoint of the president. And from the White House's standpoint, they look at this as an opportunity to get the advice and counsel of members of the Judiciary Committee, since they will be overseeing the process. So what the White House has said is that, the president will continue his outreach with members of both parties, in this instance hosting Senate Judiciary Democrats at the White House tomorrow, but they also note that he has been continuing conversations with Republicans, and that in addition to that, he is also consulting with a diverse group of legal experts as he considers a range of candidates. So that's pretty much where the process stands right now, continuing to get input. I did have a chance to speak with Senate Judiciary Chairman Dick Durbin a short time ago to see, for instance, if the list of candidates or contenders is still at least a dozen or so, which the White House had suggested a couple of weeks ago, or if they're starting to pare that down. He said he didn't know, but again, these are kind of the questions and discussions that are likely to be had when these members meet with the president tomorrow. Also, Senator Dianne Feinstein, also a member of the Judiciary Committee, telling me a short time ago she really is looking at this as an opportunity to kind of ascertain the president's views to see where he stands at this point in his search process.
Christina, I don't want to be unfair. I don't want to say bring us up to speed on everything that's happening in Ukraine, but bring us up to speed on the most important developments of the last 24 hours or so.
I mean, the big thing now is we're still in this kind of, mini Cold War where the U.S. is waiting for the Russian response to the U.S.'s response to Russia's demands. And so far, everybody's in a bit of a holding pattern. Now, what the U.S. is looking at is how to approach this in a way where everybody can kind of walk away from it saving face, including the U.S., feel like they got something out of it without compromising the security of America's allies, without compromising the security of Ukraine, and with in a way that encourages Russia to de-escalate from the borders, right? They've still got all these forces in Belarus. They've still got all these forces up against Ukraine's border. And Putin has said at the moment, he says the troops that are in Belarus are going to go home after their exercises. But the Ukrainian president said, yeah, okay, but I'll believe that when I see it. We've heard this before.
Sure, and there's conversation about some kind of low-level preparation in case there needs to be large-scale evacuations of Americans. What do we know about that?
I think you need to think about this in the context of what we saw the last time we needed to evacuate an embassy, which was Afghanistan, which was Kabul. This is a very different situation. No one is saying we're anywhere near the need to evacuate, every American diplomat from Kyiv at this point. But as you mentioned in your intro, the president has been encouraging Americans in Ukraine to leave. That's for a couple reasons. First of all, they just don't want any collateral damage. They don't want Americans to be hurt. It's a heightened security situation. And that's also because they want to avoid a kind of rush to the exits if something does happen. Now, if that were the case, the U.S. is not going to send troops into Ukraine. They believe that would be an escalatory measure, and they don't want to start a conflict with Russia. But there are American forces around Ukraine, right? The U.S. has sent about 2,000 troops to Poland. There's about 1,000 or so in Romania. And what they could be used to do is set up kind of catching points across the border, where as Americans are taking, because keep in mind, this is not Kabul. There are multiple land routes, safe land routes, west, out of harm's way in this situation, which is very good and makes an evacuation hopefully easier if it comes to that. So the U.S. forces could be set up on the opposite sides of this border to get ready to catch the Americans, to process them, to find them ways out, to find them ways back to the States if that's what they need. And the Pentagon has warned over and over again that a full-scale invasion could lead to up to 5 million refugees. So you could see those American troops doing things like facilitating refugee camps, setting up, places for these people to go if it does come to that and people start leaving Ukraine by the millions.
Christina, as you well know, France's President Emmanuel Macron has been somewhat busy. He was in Moscow, then he was in Kyiv. Talked to President Biden today. What does the White House State Department see the French role being and the possible importance of this dialogue with the president?
Well, the French see their role. They've been involved in this for a while. There was something called the Normandy process and then the Minsk Accord, which was kind of a French brokered ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine back in 2015. And it fell apart because it was basically a sequencing order, right? The Ukrainians said, OK, we need the Russian troops to leave first before we give you kind of any kind of political autonomy. The Russians said, no, we want political guarantees before we leave, we remove our troops. And then it just kind of fell apart. And we're in the same place that we've been. So the French have been trying to keep this at the forefront for a while, kind of when the U.S. and other countries weren't paying as much attention to it. Now that it's at the very front of foreign affairs, President Macron thinks that he might be a less divisive figure, a more acceptable person for the Russians to deal with. He knows President Zelensky very well. He's dealt with him over months and months and months. And France is hoping because, a lot of this is the U.S. trying to negotiate on behalf of Ukraine, on behalf of European allies. This is a European negotiating on behalf of Europe. So maybe that'll be more palatable to everyone. And hopefully maybe the French can make some inroads where the Americans may not have been. Now, there was a bit of a snafu, if you will, on the flight with Macron. Some of the reporters said that the president said, essentially, it would be great if Ukraine would maybe the solution is for Ukraine to become like Finland and just state its neutrality. And that was kind of walked back instantly because the big sticking point in this, as you know, Major, has been Russia says we want guarantees that Ukraine will never join NATO. NATO and the U.S. and Ukraine have said, hey, that's not up to you. That's up to us. You can't force us to do that. So it would be a bit of a win to Russia if all the allies, agreed that Ukraine should pledge its neutrality. So that's been walked back. The State Department was asked about that earlier today, and they only commented on the walked back comments from the French and reiterated that the U.S. supports NATO's self-determination and Ukraine's self-determination. So TBD as to where they've gotten in these negotiations.
Right. Another potential problem in examining whether or not Ukraine could be anything like Finland. Finland does not have Russian-backed forces in any part of its country. Ukraine currently does. Nicole, I want to ask you about an issue that's been simmering on Capitol Hill for a long time, but it's gotten a little bit more prominence recently. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi said she would accept a ban on members of Congress owning and trading stocks. Now, if there's ever an issue in which the details and the devilish nature thereof are really important, what are some of the details in the Speaker's plan, to the degree we know them?
Yeah, well, keep in mind, this is still in the infant stages, and at this point, there is not necessarily legislation. There are a lot of different proposals from a variety of members, and so what the Speaker is saying is that she thinks a lot of these proposals should get a fair review, and so she kind of wants to work this through the committee process, through the House Administration Committee, to kind of vet some of these various proposals. One thing she did acknowledge is that she would potentially like to see there be tighter fines, for instance, on those who violate the Stock Act, which is already currently law. And there have been some talk about, potentially amending that particular piece of legislation. So that is one change she noted she would like to see. She also believes that whatever reforms are implemented shouldn't just be limited to Congress, but should be government-wide. And she made the point today that, for instance, on the federal judiciary, her concern is that, many judges don't have to necessarily disclose, what types of stocks they may have. So, if there's going to be this crackdown, that it shouldn't just be limited to members, that this should be something that is government-wide. So it is an evolution in her position, because when she was asked about this late last year, she seemed to indicate that she didn't favor a ban on members of Congress or their spouses, saying that this is a free market economy. But, as more members have put forth proposals, she wants to be supportive of members and their ideas, which is why it seems she's giving it some consideration.
Election year considerations might play a role there as well, just a thought. Nicole, as you also well know, there is a movement among some House staffers to form a union in hopes of achieving what they believe unions could achieve through collective bargaining: higher wages, better working conditions. How much of this is a topic? How serious does this feel on the Hill?
Oh, well, look, I had a chance to talk to Congressman Andy Levin, who introduced the resolution today, and he is very passionate about this and hopeful about its prospects, although it is going to be a heavy lift going forward. Look, basically the resolution he puts forth simply makes an adjustment in law that already exists from some 20 years ago that, in essence, allowed workers here on Capitol Hill to organize, but, it was more kind of entities like the U.S. Capitol Police or the Library of Congress, and so it wasn't necessarily extended to House staffers, and so that's basically what his resolution does. It kind of just triggers that opportunity to at least give them that chance if that's what they want to do. We do know that there is an organization that was recently stood up, the Congressional Workers Union, that is kind of working around some of these issues about how they would organize. But again, this is going to be a multi-step process in the sense that, you have, in essence, 535 different employers here on Capitol Hill, and every member views this issue differently. So while some members are supportive of unions, other members aren't, and so there are questions about whether you have this broad ability to have collective bargaining on a wide scale, or if this is going to be kind of a member driven thing where some offices allow unions and others don't. So there are some real serious issues here to navigate, but I think among staffers there is a sense of hope and optimism from the standpoint that it at least gives them an opportunity to try to vocalize some of their concerns in a more meaningful way. As you know, a lot of this came to light through an anonymous Instagram account, of various staffers griping about some of the conditions on the Hill. But now, this kind of starts to give them a vehicle to actually organize if they wish to do so.
Christina, understandably, Ukraine has been a huge topic at the State Department, the Pentagon, also Syria for a couple of days last week, importantly so. But Secretary of State Antony Blinken is in Australia. The Olympics are going on in Beijing. There's continuing tension between the United States and China. What's the purpose of his trip?
Yeah, it's a really long way to go. I think it took them more than 24 hours. You've been on that plane. It doesn't have a lot of range. There were a lot of stops, a lot of fuel burned. But it's a way for the administration to show that they realize that just because, the world's focus gets laser pointed at one issue like Ukraine, other issues in the world that you mentioned keep bubbling. And this is part of the U.S.'s effort to pivot to Asia, to counter China, which is something the Biden administration has said it wanted to do, the Trump administration has said it wanted to do, the Obama administration said it wanted to do. And every single time we hear this, we're going to pivot to Asia, we're going to pivot to Asia, some other policy thing comes up and distracts the administration and they get side-railed. So this is an effort by the administration to keep focused on that, to keep allies in the region confident that the U.S. is not going to get distracted somewhere else. The secretary is meeting with the Quad, which is the U.S., Australia, India, and Japan. He's also going to Fiji to meet with some Indo-Pacific leaders who have been wooed by China, try to, counter the influence there. And then they're going to talk about that AUKUS submarine program, which is an agreement between the U.S., the UK, and Australia to let Australia have U.S. nuclear submarine technology. But as you mentioned, there's this thing with China and Putin as well. And it comes back around to, in a globalized society, all of these issues relate and they're all intertwined. And so, as we're focusing on a region where normally you're talking about North Korea, you can bet that this meeting between Putin and Xi will be coming up because these are countries that don't want to see China getting aggressive in their sphere, and they're concerned about Chinese influence. And so that's something all these leaders are going to talk about, even in the backdrop of everything that's going on in Eastern Europe.
Christina Ruffini and Nicole Killion, thank you so very much.